Okay, I usually don't make videos like this, but I wanted to be able to make one here because um, I felt like this was too important to be able to miss. So, um, I want to give a quick disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer and I am no way at all certified for legal advice. This is more or less just based off of public records and public information that I managed to be able to look up online on federal and state sources, a lot of which I'll link down below. But do not take my word for it just on regular stuff on, social media and whatever, especially for something as important as this. If you really want to be able to verify the information I've seen, please contact a lawyer or someone who actually ends up basically having certified for legal advice and check it within your state laws, your federal laws, or whichever. But yeah, I'm more or less just doing this for myself, because I felt like the information was important enough for people to be able to hear. So, yeah. So the SAFE Act, whether you agree with it or not, it seems very likely that it's going to pass. And if you don't like the SAFE Act and you think that it ends up being to destroy democracy and cut so many people off from the voting system, I understand that. But for people who want to be able to vote, or even just anybody, if you want to be able to make sure that you can be a citizen that's able to vote within the U.S., I'd say it's best to be able to prepare regardless. And basically, the best way to be able to explain all this is be able to just give a quick rundown from the SAFE Act for people who already don't know or haven't looked it up yet. The SAFE Act isn't just an act being used so that they can be able to just have voter integrity and prevent immigrants or illegals from being able to fraudulently jack the election or something. It's going to affect a variety of different actual legal Americans who are in the country. So, what it basically has done is, to summarize very quickly, is threefold. One, it bans online registration. Two, you can't be able to vote by mail or mail-in ballots. And three, the only real legal way that you have in order to be able to vote within an election, according to the SAFE Act, is to show up at a polling place carrying real physical proof of citizenship documents. And those documents generally end up being two things: your unexpired passport, or a copy of or your original birth certificate. Now, a lot of people have had a problem with this, in particular the elderly, because the whole reason as to why we had mail-in voting in the first place wasn't just as a cheap way so that we could try to steal elections. It was because people physically are not capable of being able to show up over at polling places. A lot of them either end up being able to have illnesses or areas where they're not capable of being able to show up at places at certain times, or over on the fact that their nearest polling places might be hours away and they have to be able to go in and be able to get transportation there. And that's assuming on the fact that they even end up having a car or other systems where they can be able to go in and being able to get to that place on time. As well as for online voter registration being for people who want to be able to register for vote but don't end up being able to have easy access to be able to get to a polling place as well. So basically, two methods that we have for being able to have people with disabilities or without an easy access to be able to get to a polling station can still be able to participate in registering an election. But under the SAFE Act, both those methods are going to be gone, and you are going to be able to require to have to go to a polling place in order to vote. Which is ironic, too, because news has been made on the fact that Donald Trump basically just voted by mail. And, he's removing a lot of the ways in which regular people and other people can be able to use mail-in voting in order to register to vote. But that's its own thing. apparently within the document, it does say over on the fact that it's not completely removing mail-in voting. It's just only going to be limited to people who end up being under special circumstances. So if you don't end up fit within that criteria, well, then you're not going to be able to vote by mail. Another major concern about this is on the fact that, the 2 documents needed for, bringing into a polling place in order to register to vote, also ends up being able to affect married couples, particularly ones that end up changing their names. And the rationale for this is because if you bring your birth certificate over to a polling place and your actual name ends up being different than what it says on the certificate, then they're going to be able to flag you for fraud. And best case scenario, you end up being delayed from being able to get the vote, or you might just be flagged and you're not going to be capable of being able to vote at all. So that ends up being a major problem for people who aren't even necessarily trying to commit fraud or aren't illegals or immigrants or whatever. They're just regular people who just haven't updated their state records. So the major issue that people have is regards to the system that they need to go to in order to update their birth certificates. Well, it goes twofold. One, in a variety of states, you have the ability to be able to request your birth certificate. You can either be able to do it through, say, a county recorder, or you can be able to do it through a service what's called Vital Records, which allows you to be able to order your birth certificate via mail. And you have to be able to pay a small fee in order to do so. However, in other cases, you can be able to still get your birth certificate and may still be denied because your birth certificate hasn't been updated, or in certain cases, not even certified. So then you have to be able to go in and also through services like Vital Records to be able to make a request to be able to update your birth certificate to be able to match your name change. And according from what I've read, there are 2 ways you can be able to do that. One of which is through a court order. The other is through a correction affidavit. And within, I think, either of those scenarios, you have to, depending over on your state laws, you have to be able to pay a statutory fee for whatever process you have to go through in order to be able to update your records. You also end up having the issue of delayed birth certificates. These are for people who basically did not end up having their parents or their legal guardians of choice be able to actually record their date of birth with the state, or certify their birth certificate with the state, and they basically just don't have one at all. Meaning there's no real actual proof of citizenship these people have that they could be able to use to verify who they are, to be able to apply for other things, such as driver's licenses, jobs, any type of basically legal work that you can be able to do in America. Because we need, in order to be able to, be hired or employable, you have to be able to be a U.S. citizen, with the exception of a very small degree of odd jobs that don't necessarily require that type of, documentation or oversight. And this has been a big problem within certain states like Colorado, with one of the most common issues being home births, where people end up being born at home, but the records or whatever just either weren't recorded or weren't recorded with the state. You end up having people that technically live in America, but also aren't registered, can't be able to actually prove their actual citizenship, which is why, there ends up being a major process we're going around changing the laws so that more people can be able to, through a variety of other different records that they've have over the years, or other different types of documentation that they can prove to be able to apply for a to be able to get a birth certificate, which can be able to prove that they are a legal citizen of the United States. So luckily, California, I think, either is in the process of or is overturning those laws. And similar cases are also happening in Texas. But it also ends up being able to go and prove that, there's a whole lot more other stuff that has to be, put in consideration when it comes to people being able to get access to a birth certificate, or even being able to even make one to begin with, if you really end up being able to get unlucky enough to not have, somebody to be able to give that information up to the state at the time of birth. And moving on to passports, there's a larger portion of Americans who don't end up having unexpired passports, which they again need to be able to vote. So that means they're going to have to go through a renewal process, either at their post office, or they can be able to apply for an application, to try to renew one over at the official government websites. I think that ends up being managed by the Department of Homeland Security. And basically being able to have that proof of citizenship being covered. This also ends up having a huge amount of other stuff regarding around how this is exactly going to be able to play out, because unlike with before, when you had multiple ways in which people could be able to legally participate in voting, now it's just being narrowed down almost into some stuff that you'd probably see in the 1800s or something, where it just goes down to just one way in which you can be able to vote, and it's the way that every single person now has to be able to deal with, whether or not it ends up being truly feasible for them to accomplish or not. It doesn't matter. This is also especially concerning, considering that there's been a lot of news talk regarding around that, a lot of federal employees have been laid off, some of them being able to work within polling places. So in addition to now only funneling pretty much all of America over within polling booths, with very specific documentation that they constantly need to be able to check in order for people to register and to be able to vote. Because even if you do register to vote, you still need to be able to bring those documents on the either election day or at the day when you're going to be voting. They still need to be able to verify those physical documents that everybody brings, regardless of what happens. So it's very likely they're going to be using an electronic system or some other different type of system needed for, to be able to verify your proof of citizenship. And from what I can gather, I'm not too sure about how they're going to be able to do it, but there are other systems that federal agencies use to be able to verify those two specific documents specifically, that being the electronic verification of vital event system, or EVVE, for birth certificates and, really enough, death certificates, and also the U.S. passport verification system, or USPVS, which is again overseen by the Department of Homeland Security. Basically, but what both those systems do is that they cross-check either the birth certificate or the passport with other state or federal records to be able to see if the passport or the birth certificate ends up being legit, basically to be able to prove your identity. The other reason as to why people end up thinking that this ends up being a major issue in the event that they end up using systems like this, because let's be honest, I highly doubt on the fact that they're just going to be looking at it straight through hand. They're going to be using some type of, way to be able to access either federal databases or state databases or whichever, so that they can be able to move the process along as quickly as possible with a lot of traffic. Major issue that people end up being able to have with this is that, particularly with birth certificates, that you have to not just update your birth certificate in the event that you change your name, but possibly even other records. This ends up being able to depend on what type of state record that you end up being able to update, but it also ends up being able to show how big of a process it comes in when it comes with, updating your birth certificate. So for certain people, yeah, they can be able to do that, and they can be able to afford the fees to be able to do all this stuff. But for others, it does become a bit of a hassle with, depending on what you have to be able to deal with regarding around your estate records and a large portion of like different documents and evidence that you can be able to use to, verify your identity. So you could get lucky enough and just say all you have to do is just change and update your birth certificate, or even just order it via some service like the county record or via vital records, and it will be okay. But for others, the process could be able to take weeks, maybe even months. And if someone ends up being caught with their pants down when trying to be able to, figure out that, oh no, I don't have my birth certificate. Oh no, I don't have a delayed birth certificate. Oh no, I didn't update my birth certificate so to be able to account for my name change. Or, oh no, I didn't authenticate my birth certificate with the Department of Homeland Security or whichever. Now there's a lot more people that are going to have to be filing those requests. So the major issues regarding stuff isn't on the fact that it takes people away from voting, but over on the fact that it ends up being able to make it either very expensive or an extreme hassle for people to be able to get all of those documents at the same time. It's also very likely that even if you were to be able to get, say, your unexpired passport, or you could end up being able to get a copy or your original birth certificate, or even a delayed birth certificate, you do everything right within the system, and you manage to be able to do it in a reasonable amount of time with a good amount of money that you have to be able to pay in order to do so, it still may not be enough. I've heard over on the fact that they're purging voter rolls based around social security numbers. Apparently that's being done by Elon Musk. So there's no real telling about how this system will directly be able to work out. They could be able to be using something to be able to verify your birth certificate and your passport only. Or they could also be checking other different types of information to be able to go into either federal or state or other databases just to be able to prove your identity. And maybe that ends up being okay and you end up doing everything all right. Or maybe it ends up being able to have you flagged for an error, or flagged for being able to not having the records being able to match up. And unfortunately, they might be able to declare you unfit, or saying that you're committing fraud or something. The statistic regarding on this is pretty narrow because there's only been roughly, I think, a few hundred, I think even less than that, of cases regarding on fraud between 1990s up to present day. So over the last 30 years, there's only been maybe less than, I think, either a few hundred or whichever that have tried to be able to actually commit fraud over in the last couple of different election cycles that have happened throughout the country. But it also ends up being able to show that there's just a huge amount of uncertainty that's going in over on this system, bro. I also think it's kind of crazy to a certain degree. Growing up, I've heard a lot of different arguments for some stuff like that regarding around being able to have a lot more documentation or registration and stuff for guns and gun ownership, which also ends up being a legally protected right under the Constitution. And if a fraction regarding around this system or what they're proposing with the SAVE Act was done within the gun community, those dudes would basically call it secede from the country, probably start the next civil war just off of that crap alone. Because people, it's been well noted over on the fact that although federal databases and record systems are pretty crap, they get hacked all the time. And there's a lot of stuff that goes down where, they're not necessarily the best well kept, or over on the fact that they generally end up being really crappy. Some of it by design because, certain public services end up being underfunded. So I don't really get on how people could be able to get really mad when it comes to, oh no, I shouldn't be able to have all this documentation, all this bullcrap when it comes with me having to be able to get my legal right to be able to get a firearm. But with this stuff, when being at the full mercy of the court system, when it comes with being able to prove your own identity through birth certificates, passports, driver's license, social security numbers, medical documents, all that other stuff, and it's just seen as A-okay. Even though that the variety of different ways in order to be able to get those will be pretty hard, and only very recently are starting to be able to change to make it slightly easier for people to be able to make the process smoothed out. But I'm just going to be able to say this. If you know someone or someone you or someone that know that you don't end up having either your birth certificate or you don't know for certain whether or not your passport has expired or other documentation that you may need to prove your identity might either be missing or you might need to be able to have to update it or something. You need to be able to get in and do that as quickly as you possibly can now. Because if this SAVE Act passes, and within a pretty close upcoming election, we're trying to be able to vote for who's going to be the next, mayor or the next governor or the next representative of our state or federal government. You want to be able to have people that you want to be able to represent you in either your state or your city or even your whole country. You're not going to be able to do that unless you end up being able to have the right stuff. And even then, that's not just a guarantee that everything's going to go smoothly. I mean, if I was, say, some sick, enterprising individual, and I knew that someone was just one robbery or one, jacking away from being able to take, say, some very critical documents or something that I need to be able to prove who I am, I would be able to do that within a heartbeat. Because, sure, it's mad that you may have even gotten robbed or you may have misplaced your certificate or your passport or whichever, but if you don't have those, according to the SAVE Act, you can't vote. So yeah, I say that if you really want a lot more information over on this, again, I've got some sources below. You should be able to check with either your local state representative regarding around the process, regarding around how to be able to either get a birth certificate or update one, or laws regarding around proof of your identity or the process regarding around being able to get a birth certificate or your being able to renew your passport so that you can get the right documentation to prove who you are as a U.S. citizen. So I'd say for as many people, this is not just the whole waste, fraud, and abuse thing. It's about your ability to vote thing. And very easily, you could be able to be on the chopping block if you don't end up having the right, documentations and stuff like that. And for a lot of people, it's likely that they're not going to have much of a choice within being able to do this. If there's some random hold or, other things that, is going on with ongoing court cases or something like that, or maybe even worse, you might be a felon, and that process for being able to prove your identity and stuff might get hold up or something within an ongoing case. I'm not too sure about how that would be the case, but it just does go to be able to show that there's a lot of stuff that can be able to go down in regards to being able to prove your identity or to prove your legal citizenship. So I'd say the best way to be able to deal with all that is to be able to prepare now and fast. If you advocate to be able to go to different parts of your community and tell people to be able to start being able to get their documentation, tell them to be able to go in and be able to start up that process now, offer them resources regarding on how they can be able to do so. You have a friend or a loved one that you know doesn't have their docs and stuff, best being able to get it now while you still can. Because even if you don't agree with, the SAVE Act, if you think that it ends up being able to be a threat to democracy or whichever, it's not going to be able to mean much if we can't actually be able to vote. So anyways, that's it. Like I said, if you want to be able to check out my resources, you can. Because again, like I said, they're pretty public. But that's all I've got to be able to say for now. Stay safe and make sure you're prepared.